What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a review after 100% for Prey 2017. A couple of things right off the bat. I like to review games after I 100% them, just to kind of set me apart from other reviewers, really, and a few other reasons. But on that note, this game took me in total about 60 hours, including the DLCs, to 100%. Prey is a sort of almost survival horror, but not exactly, kind of first-person RPG. And with that in mind, we are going to spoil the crap out of this game here in a little bit. I will try to avoid it here and there and call it out when we actually get into it, but keep in mind, spoilers for sure throughout this video. Now, before we get into it, it's worth mentioning that Prey 2017 is named after the original Prey, which was in 2006. However, the similarities basically end there. In interviews, it was described as being a reimagining of the original Prey, as opposed to a remake or a reboot. And while you can certainly make a couple of comparisons between the original Prey and this one, like there's some themes and stuff that are similar, that's about all they have in common. So the fact that they even named this Prey is a little strange. So with that stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and set the stage here with kind of a setup for the game. So you play as Morgan Yu, either male or female, you can pick. When it comes to difficulty options, there is a slider. This basically determines how tough your enemies are, and that's about it. There are some survival mode type options that were added with, I believe, the Moon Crash DLC. This does things like, have an oxygen level if your suit gets damaged in space, that kind of stuff. We'll get into more of that here in a bit. Adding injuries and stuff that your character can sustain, things like that. Now, when the game starts out, and it's a very strong opening, actually, you're playing as Morgan Yu, you wake up, you get a call from your brother, Alex, congratulating you on starting a job with TranStar, which is a company in universe, and then you go to your first day of work, basically. There's a weird series of tests. It doesn't seem to be going well, and then you see the scientist attacked by an alien monster of some sort. And then you black out after being gassed, wake up, and it's the same day again, except things are very wrong this time. And this is where you find out that your character was actually in a simulation. You're actually on a research base in space that is tasked with studying aliens known as the Typhon. Now, that's kind of it for the general plot setup. Now we're going to jump into world building a bit and kind of exploring the spaceship of Talos 1, which is where we are. And this is the part that's going to contain the most spoilers. So, first thing I want to mention is Talos 1 is very creepy and atmospheric. Basically, everyone is dead besides a handful of people that you come across. And I can't overstate the atmosphere. They did an amazing job of it being like this weird space station where everyone's dead, there's aliens running around, you're in empty space. The obvious comparison is like the Alien movies, but even then it's very different from even that, and they just nailed this atmosphere. Now, the ship itself is broken up into sections. Like the crew quarters, the bridge, that kind of stuff. However, I do want to mention, this is probably one of my only negatives for the world building and stuff, is that in order to traverse these zones, there's loading screens, and they are everywhere. Because you're going to find yourself running back and forth a lot, so you're going to wind up just going through loading screen after loading screen, especially towards the end of the game, when you have to go all over the ship. From one objective to another, you've got like 5 loading screens in between you and there. And that gets pretty annoying pretty quickly, and honestly kind of ruins the atmosphere a little bit that I just mentioned. Now, the environments themselves are very interactable. You can pick up and move basically everything, provided you have the skills to do so. Most items that your character can actually pick up and put in their inventory can be broken down into raw material components via this machine called a recycler. Basically, you put items into it, it turns them into generic, like, mineral, exotic materials, that kind of stuff. And then you can find fabricator plans, because the other machine besides a recycler is a fabricator, and it can take the materials that the recycler makes and turn them into useful items for you, provided you have the plan. I liked that a lot because it allowed them to fill the station with a bunch of items, and even the ones that don't seem like they would have a use wind up having a use through the recycler, if nothing else, and it really just adds a layer to the environment that I was talking about. This is also a big part of the several ways around a problem approach that Prey tends to take. Now, in addition to using all these items that I mentioned, there's also the neuromods, which we're about to get into. But basically the neuromods are your upgrade system. You can use those to give yourself new abilities and powers. And I want to mention real quick before we get into what neuromods actually are, is that between the neuromods and all of the items you can fabricate, every barrier has a way around it. Now, some barriers, for like side content and stuff, can only be dealt with in like one of two ways. However, for the most part, even if you don't have any powers or abilities, there is still a way around a problem. You just have to be able to figure out what that is exactly. For instance, if a bunch of heavy stuff is blocking a door that you don't have the appropriate ability to use your suit to lift it up and just carry it out of the way, you could potentially use an item called a recycler charge, stick it to those items, set it off, and then that recycler charge will basically destroy the items it's attached to in the immediate vicinity, turn it into raw materials, and then also clear your way. So just stuff like that. There's a lot of that kind of stuff happening where there's, again, just usually speaking, multiple ways around a problem. There are a few instances, mostly in side content, where there's really only one solution. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the neuromods that I just mentioned. So the entire point of Talos 1 is neuroscience. That's what they're studying there. Now, in this sort of alternate universe, we're about to get into some real spoilers, by the way. Not so much the initial part here, but very soon. In the alternate universe of Prey here, the governments of Russia and America were aware of the existence of the Typhon, because a Russian satellite was infiltrated by them, which is what caused the world to be aware of them. And initially, there was actually an alliance between Russian and American forces in this universe to study the Typhon. However, that goes south. America tries to do it by itself for a while before there's an incident, and they wind up just shutting the whole thing down. This is when a company called Transstar at some point manages to, I guess, bribe the appropriate people to buy what was left of this scrapped space station where there were still captive Typhon being held. And this space station eventually becomes Talos 1 over the next few years after this company, Transstar, bought it and started retrofitting it, if you want to call it that. Now, I tell you all of that to tell you this. It is, I guess, the point that there's like corruption involved in that situation. However, I do find it outlandish that a government would sell a space station with known aliens on it to just a random company. Even in this corruption-laden background they tried to make, it just seems preposterous to me personally, but that's a minor gripe and I'm not going to talk about it too much. But what did Transstar do with Talos 1, you might ask? Well, like I mentioned, they were studying neuroscience. Now, at first, this comes with the big advance of what are called neuromods. Neuromods are something, well, I mean, basically it's a giant needle you put in your eye, which is horrifying. What these neuromods actually do is they are a recording of sorts of a person's brain synapses that had a very particular skill. So say someone's a master pianist. They can make a neuromod of that person's brain. Another person can use it, and then that neuromod will make the other person who had never used a piano before in their life a master pianist. It's a way of transferring skills instantaneously, which is amazing by itself, but a few other things on there. The entire point of the main story, without going into it in any great depth, is that Transstar has been developing Typhon neuromods, because the Typhon alien species are capable of amazing things, mimicking objects, telepathy, telekinesis, all sorts of powers like that. And Transstar was developing, successfully, Typhon neuromods that would take Typhon synapses and successfully put them into human brains, effectively giving those humans superpowers, literally. However, as you might imagine, there are some negatives involved. For starters, with all neuromods, all of them, they can be removed from a person. However, upon removal, a neuromod will basically reset that person's memory to the point at which the neuromod is installed, which is why our character, Morgan Yu, doesn't remember anything about the simulation that they were in at the start of the game. And it's actually described, I think, pretty perfectly by a character in game as this sort of memory hamster wheel for research purposes. But in addition to that gigantic drawback, the Typhon neuromods in particular are apparently able to change a person's personality. And you kind of see that with Morgan Yu. It's heavily implied that that's kind of part of the story, is that the Typhon neuromods change a person, though they're a little vague about what that means. And then there is the even darker aspect of the neuromods just across the board. You can actually kind of miss this part, but if you're paying attention, you'll quickly realize that the way neuromods are made is by killing the person that makes them. Apparently, whatever process they use to extract the brain pattern, if you will, of the person that they will then make neuromods of, it kills the person that they get it from. Now, it does seem, and it seems to be heavily implied, very much so, that once they've got that initial brain reading, they can just mass produce the neuromod for it. However, in order to get that initial reading, it kills the person involved. Okay, so this next part is major spoilers, just major spoilers, absolutely. And I debated whether or not to even include it in the review, but I think it's important that I do because it recontextualizes the entire game. So I'm going to talk about the endings pretty significantly here. So if you don't want to hear about it, click off. So the endings to this game, I don't know. It's kind of a love and hate thing for me. There's the actual on Talos 1 ending where you have to choose to either save the station in its research by disabling the Typhon, so to speak, or destroy the research by blowing up Talos 1 and effectively all of the Typhon on it, keeping them from reaching Earth. However, even if you save the research station, it is still implied that the Typhon never make it to Earth, which is important, and we'll get into that later during the DLC section. But once this happens and you see the end cutscene of whatever you chose to do, suddenly your character wakes up, and it turns out that what was actually happening the entire time is that Alex Yu, your brother, is alive and well, whereas Morgan Yu is apparently dead. Because what you actually are is a Typhon that they installed Morgan's memories onto, trying to teach it empathy. Because this is where we learn that the entire game is a simulation, the Typhon have already escaped Talos 1 and taken over Earth, and that Alex is doing his absolute best to find a bridge between the Typhon and humanity. Because the primary reason the Typhon and humanity don't get along, and why I specifically haven't mentioned it up to this point until I talked about this, is that the Typhon lack what are called mirror neurons, which basically means that they can't feel empathy for other living things, which means they just kill humans blatantly. Whereas Alex has been trying to instill in you and your character empathy, because what you actually are is a Typhon. And even in this ending, you can, typically speaking, choose to either kill or agree to help the people in the room, or machines, I should say, in the room. Now, on one hand, I think this ending is interesting. It's kind of a weird thing about the Typhon, because what you have to understand about the Typhon up to this point is they're not stupid. They are very intelligent, but as you learn throughout the story, it's told to you early-ish in the story that Typhon can't feel empathy. They don't kill humans out of malice, it's just what they do. They see us as a sort of convenient matter to absorb and then replicate from. So Alex, in this ending, is trying to fix that by teaching Typhon how to empathize with them by activating mirror neurons through this simulation. Now, I love this ending on one hand because of the implications for the main game, because throughout the main game you can make a lot of choices about killing or sparing people. There's even achievements for completing the game in the most empathetic way possible. There's also achievements for being an absolute lunatic and killing everything. And this ending kind of gives those routes through the game purpose. For instance, if you get labeled what's called a psychopath in game, which is basically where you killed everything, at the end of the game you don't get an option. They just put you down, because obviously you failed the simulation. They're like, well, this isn't the one, we just need to kill him. So in that regard, I really enjoyed the ending. But the other flip side of it is that it doesn't make any sense to me. Now, ignoring the fact that this ending can, in a lot of ways, just feel like a straight-up cop-out, just ignoring that entirely, the ending itself doesn't necessarily add up, because what you have to understand about the Typhon is, if they don't have mirror neurons, why are they working together? Because if they don't have these neurons, in theory, they wouldn't be able to emphasize with any living thing. And yet you constantly see them working together towards a goal. The Typhon have a sort of hierarchy that you see throughout the game. They very much so work together and coordinate. Their reproduction seems to be some sort of asexual reproduction that they manage through just consuming other living things. So if they can't feel empathy in the way that the game tries to tell you they can't, why aren't they just cannibalizing each other to reproduce? What is keeping them from doing that, I guess? And I guess my point is that they never bothered to explain that part, and it just irks me. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to the combat. So combat is pretty good. It's smooth. I like it. Feels very good, honestly, which I guess shouldn't be surprised considering the studio made titles like Dishonored. In terms of difficulty, combat can either be super easy or very difficult and better off avoided depending on the difficulty setting that you are playing on. So on higher difficulties like Nightmare or with the survival mode options turned on, you would probably be better off trying to sneak and avoid combat as much as possible. However, it is kind of everywhere. Now, actual weapons are limited. There's only a handgun, a shotgun, this glue gun, which doesn't actually deal damage, there's a stun gun, and you get a wrench. Actual weapon-wise, that's basically it. However, you get a lot of powers and stuff through the neuromods that I mentioned. These come in human abilities and Typhon abilities. Human abilities are usually about getting around things. You know, hacking, repairing things, that kind of stuff. Whereas the Typhon powers are more about just straight up killing things. So if you take the Typhon powers, it will make you better at combat, whereas human abilities typically make you better at solving problems. Now the Typhon powers are super fun to play around with, and there are several achievements for running through the game using powers or not using powers. There's an achievement for running through the game once with only human abilities and then doing it again with only Typhon abilities. There's an achievement for not using neuromods at all, which is possible, but it's a pain. So all of those things combine to make combat kind of interesting and as challenging as you want it to be, I'll put it that way. But overall, the experience is very smooth. Personally, what I enjoyed the most was running around with the shotgun with the human gunsmith ability, which let you completely max out the weapons because you can use weapon upgrade kits to like increase the power of weapons. But combining that shotgun with some of the Typhon powers, which just do devastating amounts of damage, personally I find that combo, specifically the kinetic blast you get early on, to be really fun as far as like actually hitting things goes. But as I mentioned, combat, much like traversal of the station, there's usually more than one solution to your problem. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about the DLC. Now, there are 2 DLCs, however they are split up, and what I mean by that is that there is Moon Crash and Typhon Hunter. Moon Crash is part of the base game. Typhon Hunter is like a separate item in your Steam library. Like it's treated as like a different game altogether. So Typhon Hunter is a sort of like little multiplayer mini game where a bunch of people will be mimics and one will be Morgan Yu. Mimics are Typhon that can just mimic objects. It's, you know, the one all the marketing was for. So Typhon Hunter is, again, kind of more of a multiplayer thing. Didn't really mess with that much. It didn't have much to do with the base game at all. However, Moon Crash has a ton to do with the base game and is super fun. So in Moon Crash, you explore a simulation of the Pythias base. Pythias is the moon base that provided all the materials and resources to Talos 1. Basically, it was like Talos 1's supply hub. Now, throughout the main game, you can find out about this other company, Chasma, which is actively seeking to basically learn all of Transstar's secrets. And in Moon Crash, we see Chasma employing a hacker to run a stolen bit of data, or kind of a simulation that they made out of that data, about the final days of Pythias, which is to say before the Typhon outbreak wiped the base out. Now, Moon Crash itself is a roguelike. Basically, you keep running this simulation over and over again in a roguelike manner with potentially 5 different characters until you fulfill all these orders that Chasma, your employer, made for you. Overall, really cool DLC actually. Had a couple of annoying achievements that took forever, but in addition to being this roguelike that's kind of fun to play and stuff, there's actually a lot of story to it. And Moon Crash actually explains how, no matter how the main ending happened, how the Typhon actually got back to Earth, which I thought was really cool. So again, spoilers real quick, but basically, after you fulfill your contract to Chasma, the hacker you're playing is like basically just thrown away. They try to kill him. However, he manages to escape, ironically crashes into the moon, hence the Moon Crash title, and then escapes back to Earth via a shuttle that was left on the Pythias base. However, he inadvertently brings a mimic back to Earth with him that then, in theory, eats things, replicates, immediately gets out of control, and then the whole world is taken over by Typhon, more or less, which then leads back to the main ending being a simulation. I thought that was a nice touch. I like how they blended that together. That DLC even takes the time to explain how Chasma got the data that they are running the simulation with, which I thought was really cool. Now, gameplay-wise, again, it's just a roguelike. You can use simulation points as you kill things and earn them to give yourself better gear at the start of the simulation, and you just kind of keep running through the same 4 areas over and over again, doing a little better each time. Very roguelike mechanics. So let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this bad boy up. So, positives. Loved the atmosphere. The Typhon are super cool. The pseudoscience is cool. A lot of it doesn't make sense if you like dig a little deeper into it, but you know, it's sci-fi, so it doesn't have to. I'm not going to give it any negatives for that. But I like the concept of the Typhon probably more than anything. I don't think some of it is explained super well, but you know, that kind of adds to the mystery in some ways. But like just visually, they look very cool. And like the way they move on screen as you fight them is just unnerving. Now, negatives, I didn't have a ton. This is a well-done game, honestly. So to show you how little I have in the way of negative comments, the title annoys me, which is honestly reaching, let's be real. I don't know, I don't like that they named this game Prey. Like it doesn't have anything to do with that original title. I feel like they had this IP in their back pocket and they were like, we should do something with this. And then they just decided to name this game Prey. You could have named this game anything else. That's how little connection it has with the first game. Like there's some themes there, sure. But beyond that, it doesn't make any sense. I think they should have named this game something else. And then the only other big negative, like there's some minor stuff. The loading screens annoyed the crap out of me because honestly, there's just too many. And then I actually didn't mention this, but as you explore Talos 1, you can kind of do like the zero gravity stuff here and there. And just maneuvering in zero gravity is frustrating, but you know, like it's zero gravity, so I don't know what I was expecting. But my only real other negative than that is that the parts for the Typhon just don't make any sense. And again, you could easily argue that it's an alien species, Mortem. They're not supposed to make sense. And yeah, fair point. I'm not even going to argue that. But it irked me personally that they didn't try to explain some of this stuff that is just so easily being like, well, that doesn't check out. Like, again, the mirror neurons thing. But beyond that, overall, very good game. I think this game is very sadly underrated. Sales performance-wise, it did like 60% less than I think Dishonored 2 did in its opening week. But that said, there were some other factors that contributed to that, such as Bethesda Publishing, withholding review copies until the day of release. So nobody even knew what to expect from this game, especially because they kept calling it a reimagining. So things like that I think ultimately hurt the sales. However, ignoring all that, very good game. All of it is very polished. There's a lot going on. The atmosphere is intense. It's a shame this game didn't do better. I would be very surprised if there's ever a sequel to this. I honestly don't think it needs one. I think one would be cool, but as it is, the story's fine. I think where they left it is perfectly okay. Kind of leave something to the imagination. But Prey with the DLC is $40, and for $40, you are getting an amazing game that has a ton of content. So I definitely think it's worth picking up if you haven't. If you're thinking about trying it because you've heard good things, you absolutely should. So with that out of the way, truly, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.